When we think of Roman emperors, a very specific image often comes to mind. Marble statues of stoic white men, clad in togas, commanding armies and ruling over vast territories. This image has been etched into our collective imagination for centuries. But what if history was hiding a more diverse and surprising truth? What if some of Rome's most powerful figures, its emperors, were actually of African descent? It may sound shocking, but the truth is more complex and far more fascinating than the textbooks let on. To understand the presence of black emperors in Rome, we first need to break the myth that the Roman Empire was a purely European or white civilization. In reality, Rome was the world's first superpower, a vast multicultural empire that stretched across 3 continents: Europe, Asia, and Africa. Its armies, citizens, senators, and even emperors came from all corners of the empire. Africa, in particular, was not just a passive province on the edge of Rome. It was a vital part of the empire's wealth, military power, and leadership. One of the most important regions was North Africa, especially modern-day Tunisia, Libya, and Algeria. These areas were home to sophisticated cities like Carthage and Leptis Magna, centers of Roman administration, culture, and learning. The people of these cities were full Roman citizens. Many of them rose to high ranks in the army, the government, and even the imperial family. So, yes, there were Africans at the very top of Roman society, and in some cases, they ruled the empire itself. The most famous and powerful example is Lucius Septimius Severus. Born in 145 AD in Leptis Magna, in modern-day Libya, Severus was a Roman citizen of mixed ancestry, including Punic and Libyan Berber roots. He wasn't just a provincial governor or military general. He became emperor in 193 AD, after a brutal period of civil war known as the Year of the Five Emperors. Septimius Severus emerged victorious and seized the imperial throne. He ruled for nearly 2 decades, expanded Rome's borders, crushed rebellion, and rebuilt the state. And here's where it gets interesting. Ancient sources describe Septimius Severus as having dark skin, curly hair, and features that clearly suggest African heritage. Contemporary art, including busts and mosaics from North Africa, depict him with a darker complexion than the emperors who came before. Even more telling is how later Roman writers and rulers tried to downplay or ignore his African identity. It's as if history wanted to erase the parts that didn't fit the Roman ideal. But Severus was no puppet ruler or token figure. He was a military genius and political strategist. He overhauled the Roman army, creating reforms that would influence Rome for generations. He traveled throughout the empire, including a famous campaign in Britain, where he reportedly remarked that the Britons cannot be trusted. In fact, he died in York, England, far from the deserts of Africa, where he was born. Septimius Severus brought Africa to the center of Roman power. His wife, Julia Domna, was a powerful Syrian woman, and their sons, Caracalla and Geta, were heirs to a multicultural royal lineage. Caracalla, who succeeded his father and ruled as emperor from 198 to 217 AD, continued this legacy. While Caracalla is mostly remembered for granting Roman citizenship to nearly all free men in the empire, few people talk about the African bloodline he inherited from his father. This wasn't an isolated case. The Severan dynasty was filled with people of African and Middle Eastern descent. Some held the title of emperor, others were consuls, governors, and military commanders. In fact, during the 3rd century AD, a time when the empire was struggling to maintain control, many of its strongest leaders came from the provinces of Africa and the Eastern Mediterranean. Why don't we hear more about this? Why are these black emperors missing from most school textbooks and history documentaries? Part of the answer lies in how history is written and who gets to write it. In the centuries after the fall of Rome, European historians and artists began to reshape the image of Rome in their own likeness. During the Renaissance, when classical art and ideas were revived, the image of Roman leaders became whiter, more aristocratic, and less diverse. Statues were scrubbed clean. Portraits were stylized to match European ideals. And over time, the multicultural reality of ancient Rome was pushed into the shadows. But make no mistake, the evidence is there. Archaeological finds, ancient texts, and surviving art all point to a more diverse Rome than we've been led to believe. And now, scholars and historians are beginning to peel back the layers of myth to uncover the truth. This isn't about rewriting history. It's about recovering it, about recognizing the roles that African people played not just as slaves or soldiers, but as emperors, thinkers, and nation builders. It's about acknowledging that Rome wasn't built by one race or one people, but by a rich tapestry of cultures that included black and brown men at the very top of the chain. In the next section, we'll explore how African leadership shaped the empire during its most turbulent years, and how later generations tried to erase that truth from memory. We'll also look at the legacy of these black emperors and what they mean for our understanding of identity, power, and history today. As the Roman Empire moved into the 3rd century AD, the world it once dominated with ease began to shift beneath its feet. External threats multiplied, internal corruption festered, and the stability of Rome wavered. But through this turbulence, one thing remained steady: leadership from Rome's African and Eastern provinces. While history often paints this era as one of decay, it's also a time when men of Africa descent stepped up to hold the empire together, sometimes quite literally saving it from collapse. Let's go back to the Severan dynasty. After Septimius Severus's death in 211 AD, his sons Caracalla and Geta were set to rule together. But the peace didn't last long. Caracalla, known for his brutality, had his younger brother Geta murdered in front of their mother and took sole control. His reign was defined by both savagery and sweeping reforms. One of the most significant was the Constitutio Anniniana, a law that granted Roman citizenship to all free men within the empire, an unprecedented move that made millions of provincial people full Romans overnight. This was a radical act of inclusion, driven by an emperor with African heritage. Caracalla's mixed reputation, tyrant to some, reformer to others, has often overshadowed the larger point. He was continuing a dynasty founded by an African emperor. His actions brought the periphery into the center and broke down one of Rome's most powerful racial and social barriers. Yet, textbooks rarely celebrate this as a moment of empowerment for Rome's African and Eastern populations. After Caracalla's assassination in 217 AD, Rome entered a volatile period called the Crisis of the 3rd century. Over the next 50 years, the empire would see over 20 emperors rise and fall. But what's often overlooked is that many of the most capable among them were born in the provinces, some with African ancestry, and others from nearby regions often racialized today as non-white. One of these leaders was Emperor Macrinus, who ruled from 217 to 218 AD. Born in Mauritania, modern-day Algeria, Macrinus was of Berber descent and had climbed the Roman political ladder not through noble birth, but through sheer competence. He began as a legal advisor, then a powerful praetorian prefect, and finally seized the throne after Caracalla's assassination. Macrinus was the first Roman emperor who had never served in the Senate, and the first clearly. North African emperor, his rule was brief and troubled, but it proved again that African-born leaders were fully capable of occupying Rome's highest seat of power. And then came Empress Julia Misa, sister of Julia Domna and aunt to Caracalla. A political mastermind from Syria, Julia Misa returned to power after Macrinus' downfall by installing her teenage grandson Elagabalus as emperor. Though Elagabalus's rule is remembered for its excess and scandal, Julia Misa herself was the true force behind the throne. She maneuvered through deadly court politics and made decisions that kept the dynasty alive, even installing her other grandson, Severus Alexander, when Elagabalus was murdered by the Praetorian Guard. What's important here isn't just the power plays, but the visibility of people from African and Eastern provinces, particularly women, at the very top of Roman political life. The Severan women wielded influence like no other Roman empresses before them. Julia Domna and Julia Misa controlled the empire behind the scenes, issuing orders, writing philosophy, and deciding who lived or died. Their Syrian ancestry, combined with Septimius Severus's North African roots, made the Severian dynasty arguably the most ethnically diverse ruling family in Roman history. Yet, when European historians of later centuries wrote about this period, they often described it as decadent or unstable. Not because of any unique failure, but because it didn't fit their idea of what Roman greatness should look like. Many classicists deliberately omitted or diminished the African origins of these rulers. They preferred to highlight barbarian invasions and civil wars, not the uncomfortable truth that the empire was repeatedly stabilized, sometimes even rescued, by African and Eastern leaders. Let's not forget Philip the Arab, who ruled from 244 to 249 AD. Though not African by origin, Philip was born in Roman Syria and had dark features, earning the nickname the Arab. His inclusion here matters because his reign overlaps with the larger narrative of Rome being led by men who wouldn't pass as white by modern Western standards. Under Philip, Rome celebrated its 1,000-year anniversary with enormous games and festivals. Despite leading during a time of crisis, he was respected for maintaining order and reaching a peace agreement with Persia, one of Rome's greatest enemies at the time. It's worth noting that this entire period, from 193 to around 250 AD, was marked by a striking shift in the ethnicity and geography of Roman leadership. Gone were the days when emperors had to be born in Italy or come from aristocratic senatorial families. The empire had become so vast and interconnected that the best talent came from everywhere, especially Africa and the East. Roman identity was no longer about skin color or place of birth. It was about loyalty to the empire and the ability to lead. Yet modern narratives of Roman history rarely reflect that. In Western media and education, Rome is still portrayed as a bastion of white, European civilization. Emperors are shown with pale skin and classical features, even when archaeology and ancient texts suggest otherwise. Busts of Septimius Severus, for example, have been whitened over the centuries. A rare surviving portrait of him with his family, painted in Egypt, clearly shows a man with darker skin. But this image is hardly ever shown in textbooks. So why does this matter today? Because history isn't just about the past. It's about power, identity, and who gets remembered. By burying the stories of Africa's role in Rome, we create a false sense of Western supremacy. We erase the fact that black and brown people once ruled the world's most powerful empire, not as invaders or outliers, but as legitimate emperors, statesmen, and reformers. In the final section, we'll explore how modern historians are working to uncover this lost legacy and why the story of Rome's black emperors has never been more relevant than it is. Right now, the story of the black emperors of Rome isn't just a historical footnote. It's a window into a broader conversation about race, identity, and the stories we choose to tell. For too long, Western history has been filtered through a narrow lens, one that favors simplicity over truth and whiteness over complexity. But Rome was never that simple, and the empire's African emperors prove it. Today, historians, archaeologists, and scholars of color are challenging the whitewashed version of Roman history that has dominated classrooms and documentaries for generations. They're asking questions that were once considered controversial. What did Roman people really look like? Who had power? And why have certain emperors been erased from our collective memory? Take Septimius Severus. His reign was one of strength, reform, and ambition. But open most history books, and you'll find only a passing mention, if any. His African roots are either ignored or downplayed. Even when his name appears, the narrative often avoids the implications of what it means that a man from Libya ruled the Roman Empire. That silence is not accidental. It's the result of centuries of selective memory, driven by politics, colonialism, and racism. In the 18th and 19th centuries, when Europe was at the height of its colonial power, there was a deliberate effort to craft a vision of history that placed Europeans at the center of all greatness. Classical Rome was used as a tool of empire, a model for architecture, philosophy, military conquest, and racial superiority. Any parts of Roman history that didn't fit that model, including the existence of African rulers, were quietly removed or reinterpreted. One striking example is a surviving Roman-era painting known as the Fium portrait of Septimius Severus and his family. It is one of the few surviving colored images of a Roman emperor. In it, Septimius is clearly darker-skinned than his wife Julia Domna and his sons. Yet, reproductions of this image are rare, and it's often absent from modern history texts. Why? Because it directly challenges the idea that Roman emperors, and by extension, greatness, must be white. Modern researchers have used tools like genetic testing, archaeological digs, and re-examinations of ancient texts to reveal the empire's diversity. They found African DNA in Roman graves across Europe, uncovered statues with African features in elite Roman homes, and traced records showing high-ranking officials from Egypt, Nubia, and North Africa. This wasn't a white empire with a few exceptions. Rome was a melting pot built by people of every race, religion, and language. The erasure of Rome's African emperors matters not just because it distorts the past, but because it affects how we view the present. For people of African descent, especially in the West, history often begins with slavery or colonization. But the truth is far richer. Before the transatlantic slave trade, before European colonization, black men and women led nations, built empires, and shaped civilizations. The Roman Empire is one of the clearest examples of that legacy, and yet it remains hidden. That's why this story needs to be told. Not to rewrite history, but to reclaim it. To give young black people, and all people, the knowledge that their ancestors were more than victims of oppression. They were emperors. They were generals. They were thinkers and builders of one of the greatest civilizations in world history. But it's not just about representation. It's also about how we understand power. If we acknowledge that a man from Libya could rule the Roman Empire, that a Syrian woman could dominate court politics, and that an African-born soldier could become emperor, then we are forced to question modern ideas of race and leadership. We are forced to admit that greatness has never been limited to one continent, one language, or one skin tone. Popular culture is slowly catching up. Shows like HBO's Rome, Netflix documentaries, and historical podcasts are beginning to embrace the diversity of ancient history. But there's still a long way to go. Until African emperors like Septimius Severus, Macrinus, and others are taught in schools alongside Julius Caesar and Augustus, the story remains incomplete. This is where platforms like yours, Lost Histories, play a crucial role. By bringing these stories to life through engaging videos, bold titles, and powerful visuals, you're not just entertaining people. You're educating them. You're planting seeds that might inspire someone to pick up a history book, ask new questions, or see their ancestry in a different light. In the end, history isn't just about the past. It's about the future we're building. If we want a world where everyone sees themselves as capable of greatness, we have to tell the truth about where we've been and who we've been. The Black Emperors of Rome weren't exceptions or accidents. They were products of a vast, multicultural empire that valued talent, strategy, and strength, regardless of skin color. So next time someone tells you Rome was a white empire, tell them about Septimius Severus, the African warlord who became emperor. Tell them about Caracalla, who gave citizenship to millions of people who didn't look Roman by today's standards. Tell them about Macrinus, the Berber lawyer who rose from humble roots to rule the empire. Tell them that history is bigger, richer, and blacker than they ever imagined. Because the truth always finds its way back.